All right. Whoa, that's loud. Okay, I'm gonna turn that down. There we go. Okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Ooh, lights. Oh, lights. Okay. Whiteboard on. And there we go. There aren't too many light switches in there. All right. All righty. Perfect. I guess I'll do. Okay, so welcome. If you're planning on watching the video or live streaming today, I'll apologize in advance. I don't know how good the sound will be. I left my microphone in my little clip-on mic in my office. It's one of those days. My TA for one class isn't back from her Christmas holidays, so I had to cover her job, which means I've had like 10 minutes the entire day to do anything, and I prioritized getting another cup of coffee instead of getting my act together. So, apologies in advance. I've just got it running off the laptop speaker for now. Okay, so obviously last time, so I guess Thursday, we started getting into concepts and theories in sociology, and today we're going to look at some of the big kind of cultural traditions and kind of how they interpret social phenomena, right? So there's three really big traditions in sociology: structural functionalism, more commonly just referred to as functionalism, conflict theory, which sometimes you can colloquially call Marxism, and then symbolic interactionism. And then there's some smaller traditions that intersect in some ways, things like feminism, queer theory, which we'll kind of go through as well and look at, their way of interpreting the social world. And especially things like the cultural turn in conflict theory is a really interesting kind of thing to look at. Okay, so I think we ended off last time. One slide had a lot of things. The other one had none. Okay. I don't know. All right, clear. What was the order of religious groups that had the highest rate of suicide again? Highest rate was atheists, then Protestants, then Catholics, then Jewish people. Okay. I don't know what that means. I'm just gonna dismiss that. Talking about psychological disorders, Durkheim found what? Oh, so in this case, Jews had the most, Protestants had the second most, then Catholics, and then atheists. But it didn't correlate. Mental disorders didn't correlate to suicide, really, which was the funny thing about it. Okay. Yeah. So I guess we ended off last class talking about Durkheim's suicide study, which basically, again, it's just a way of looking at a particular phenomenon through a sociological lens. And in this case, right, Durkheim cues on social bonds or social solidarity as the key in kind of questions of suicide. It was those who had the fewest social bonds with the highest risk of suicide at the end of the day. Okay, so our big traditions. Other questions? No. All right. So functionalism. Functionalism is the first of our big sociological traditions. Not necessarily the first chronologically, but the first that we're going to talk about. And here, the key thinker, I probably have him on another slide. No, I don't actually. The key thinker is the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. Right? So Durkheim is sort of the founder of the functionalist school of sociology. Okay, so we're talking about functionalism, right? So you can think of functionalism as basically kind of classing, social institutions and their outcomes into either one of two categories, right? Either something is, functional, or dysfunctional. Oops. right? So, what Durkheim kind of suggests in his sociological theories is that all of human life is governed by social structures, right? By social institutions of some kind, right? Stable patterns of social relationships, social structures, social institutions, whatever you want to call them. And either those social structures are working, right? They're doing their job and things are working well. So, that institution and the kind of social behaviors that come out of it are functional, or they're not working, right? They've fallen into a state of dysfunction, and so whatever social relationships they were governing have kind of fallen apart, right? So either they're maintaining social stability, right? They're part of a well-ordered and well-working society, or they're not, right? And they're falling apart. Now you can think about this, think about the family, right? The family, if it's working, is doing a whole bunch of social work, right? It is passing on values and norms to the next generation. It is a place where, of mutual obligation between spouses and their children, right? Where parents have a duty to their children and to each other, and the goal of the family, and if it's working well, is producing, socially functional children. Now, if the family falls into dysfunction, right, and that as a social institution is no longer working, you're going to see things like divorce, right? That they'll no longer, spouses no longer have, a sense of mutual obligation. Children that are being raised in a dysfunctional way, right? So they're not coming out as adults that are able to navigate society. So, when we talk about it, basically in a functionalist sense, that is a social institution that can either be working or not working, right? So, what Durkheim suggests as well is that social structures aren't a given, right? There's nothing that says that the set of social structures that you have at any one particular moment in history is somehow natural to the human race, right? All of them are what you would call contingent, right? They're contingent on place, time, and society. So they are going to be different, look different in different social circumstances, but there are no givens, right? There's only kind of shared values or preferences around social institutions and social structures. Okay, so, family, we think of it, as a kind of a nuclear family, right? Mom, dad, or spouses, and kids, right? And generally speaking, right, our kind of normative idea of the nuclear family is, male, female parents, and they get together, they have children, right? Those children are theirs, right? They're biologically related to both parents, and that family stays together, raises the kids, right? And eventually, the spouses both die and are buried in a plot next to each other, right? That's our kind of normative idea. What Durkheim would suggest is that that's just one possible family form that's emerged as a kind of late modern or modern social preference. There are other family forms that could exist, and it's all kind of dependent on whatever preferences and social values are in a society, right? So you could have polygamous marriages. You could have, very rare, it only happens in like 2 or 3 societies, polyandrous marriages, right, where a woman marries multiple men. You could have, families that are temporary, right? People come together and then split apart in much more kind of, temporary ways of being. And you could have extended family as the norm, right? Where, people live amongst grandparents, aunts, uncles, relatives. There's no real kind of like set human norm, just preferences based on place, time, and society. Okay, now for Durkheim, you get social problems, right? Why do social problems exist? Well, fundamentally for Durkheim, social problems exist because some institution has fallen into dysfunction, right? It's become dysfunctional. And so whatever a social institution was doing, to kind of keep social equilibrium doesn't work anymore, right? You get the sexual revolution and norms around families change, right? Women are more empowered, they become more economically successful, and so suddenly the family doesn't work, and there's a risk of society becoming dysfunctional, right? Just as one example. Or people stop, religion, right? Religions were there to pass norms and values on to people and to kind of keep their moral behavior regulated. But if people stop attending religious services, right, and no longer believe in religious beliefs, obviously that kind of goes away. And then, there's no normative way of passing on, norms and behaviors. Regulating behaviors. So what Durkheim will argue then is that when something becomes dysfunctional, right, for whatever reason, religious institutions stopped working and people stopped believing in them, if they fell into dysfunction, that's going to create a social problem, right? And what you need then is to reestablish some kind of equilibrium. And this can be done in two kind of ways, right? Either you can reestablish that social norm, right? You can, fix up the religious institutions, make everybody start going back to, to religion, and so kind of fix the institution that's fallen into dysfunction, renovate it, maybe change it around a little bit so that it starts doing its job again. Or you create new institutions and new institutional forms that fill in the gaps that are left by that institution that's fallen into dysfunction. So sometimes people tend to think of functionalism, in terms of sociological theories as being relatively conservative, right? Because it's all about, keeping social equilibrium, right? Keeping things working in the way that they've always worked in the past. It doesn't have to be. I don't think necessarily functionalism says, right, everything needs to stay the same. But it is very much like, okay, if one set of institutions isn't working, we need to come up with a new set of institutions that is going to work and replace, whatever function has been lost when something fell into dysfunction. Okay, so the thing that we talked about last time, I forgot the accent. The suicide study is an example of functionalism, right? So in that study, right, Durkheim, sorry, I say right too much. I apologize. In that study, Durkheim basically is looking at how different religious structures either are working or not working to help people avoid taking their own lives. So, in that case, he would suggest that Protestantism is less functional in preventing suicide than, say, Judaism is. Okay. No questions so far. Great. So, along this kind of trajectory, right, what ends up happening, Durkheim is sort of the founder of this particular school of sociology, in Europe at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. Now, what ends up happening and how these schools of thought end up coming to North America, specifically the United States, and then over to Canada after that, is by people going over to study them, right? So one of the first to kind of pick up a functionalist viewpoint in a North American context is Talcott Parsons. And again, the names of these people, in their particular stories, I'm giving you just for kind of color commentary, so you understand the origins of these things. On the test, I'm not going to ask you specifically what Talcott Parsons said. I'm more interested in functionalism generally than Parsons in particular. Okay, so that said, Parsons goes off to Germany to do his PhD studies. Bless you. I'm going to take a drink there. It's just tea, sadly. So he goes off to Germany, studies kind of in a functionalist school of, both from Durkheim and people who worked with Durkheim, and he comes back and he brings that school of thought back to North America. And Parsons in particular, kind of goes about defining, the different sets of institutions in a society and what they do. And his big contribution is sort of trying to think through different institutional contexts and how they work, what their function is in society. Okay, so families, right? Effectively, their job in society is to provide a stable base to raise the next generation, right? Because any society that's worth its salt is always concerned with the future, right? They're future-oriented in the sense that they're looking at what comes next, right? What is going to happen with the next generation. Okay, the military, right, successfully, if it's functional, right, is successfully defending society against external threats. And if you want to, add what Parsons talks about in terms of the police, right, the police, it's all about internal threats. So the police are all about, defending society from internal threats, like crime, criminal organizations, law-breaking insurrections of all kinds when they're functional, right? Schools, teach students necessary skills and certain values, and especially, kind of early in schools kind of history, one of these values was nationalism, right? Or a sense of pride in your own country. Which is why you still hear echoes, right? Like if you're paying attention to some of the discourses that are going on in the United States right now, there's talk in the sort of Trump camp about bringing back the practice of saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day in schools, right? Which is something that's fallen out of favor, in the last couple of decades. And then, things like religion, right? Helping people people share a moral code, right? And passing that code down, enforcing moral norms amongst people as well, would be something that Parsons think that institutions do. Okay, so what could we have as a takeaway from Parsons? Every institution in society has its job, right? There's one or a few things that it does that keeps society flowing smoothly, working well, and keeps people happy, productive, and sort of content. Everything works well if all these institutions are functional. When they're not functional, obviously things go wrong. Okay, now, kind of a further evolution of this. We talk about Robert Merton. So Merton's another one, who brought a kind of sociological tradition back from Europe into North America. Now, Merton has a lot of things that he talks about, and certainly I'm reducing him down, in major ways to just one of his big ideas. But one of the things that he adds, to say Parsons' account, where like Parsons is like, okay, institutions do these things, right? They, the family raises the next generation, right, and holds people together in mutual obligation. Religion teaches morals and values. Schools, teach skills and other values, especially things like nationalism. What Merton kind of adds to this is an important insight, specifically that institutions sometimes have, let's say, well, they have kind of two functions, right? One of them is what you'd say it's about, right? So the manifest function is the obvious and intended effects of a social structure. The latent function is non-obvious and unintended consequences of a social structure. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Well, it basically means that any institution you create, you're going to have goals for, right? And whoever created them had certain goals, or socially when they were created organically, there's certain things that you thought they were going to do and that you expect them to do. But there's also often kind of unintended consequences or unintended effects. So let's take the university as, an example of this. The manifest function of the university, obviously, is to, educate, to teach skills, right, that are going to later be useful in the market. And that's pretty, I would say, uncontroversial, right? University, you want education. But there are then a bunch of unintended or non-obvious consequences and things that happen that universities do. So one of them is universities, while they are an educational institution, also serve as a form of a mating market. Now don't go dirty on me here. A mating market is basically where people meet and select, romantic and sexual partners, right? So while you're here, right, in the university, you're surrounded with young people, people roughly the same age as you for the most part, of various sexes, genders, sexual orientations, and such. And so in a lot of cases, and historically one of the things that universities have done, it's a little bit less true now with Gen Z because you all marry and get together much later, has been, to find, your future spouse, or at least a romantic or sexual partner, right? So, it's a place where there are lots of young people who are otherwise unattached, who might be romantically interested in you potentially, right? So, universities have long served as this, and it used to be the case, like if you go back to the silent generation and the baby boomers, the majority of them, who went to college met their spouses in college. Okay, so that's a kind of fun, hey, that's not a terrible manifest or latent function. Another thing that universities tend to do, and along with this kind of, mating market, is they sort people by social class. Because if you go to university, right, chances are you are in the middle and upper class, right? You've probably had a whole bunch of educational, and again, this is not universally true, but basically what you're having is either people from the upper and middle classes or people who are aspirants to the upper and middle classes. And so basically it creates a mating market where basically you are going to meet and get involved with people who are of similar social class or aspirants to a similar social class, right? Because everybody here, I'm assuming, is going to at least aspire to end up in the middle or upper classes of society, right? Now, there are other mating markets where people of the working class or the poor are going to meet. That looks a little bit different, right? But the university serves as a place where all of you are going towards the same goals. You're probably mostly from the same kind of class strata, and so it's a great place to meet someone that is in that strata, right? So universities also help us sort the mating market by social class, so that right, if you are trying to meet someone who's like upwardly mobile, economically probably going to be pretty successful, this is a pretty good place to look. All right. Okay, I don't know if my Slido's not working. Oh, that one works. I don't know why the other one doesn't work. Okay. I'm gonna just get rid of that. That's all good. Okay, again, we can have fun, but let's not go too crazy. When many people go to university for this goal of finding a partner rather than for educational purposes. So here's the funny thing about latent functions. You're probably not even aware that it's happening, right? As a person, you're here, you come to university for this purpose, right? And if I was to, take a poll of people in this room, why are you here in university, right? I guarantee that almost everybody is going to point in this direction, right? Because you're all attuned to the manifest function of the institution. That said, right, the latent functions will also happen. Like probably no one's here, I'm guessing. There's very few people would say, I'm here to meet a good partner that I can spend the rest of my life with. That's probably just going to happen as a kind of latent function or an unintended function of putting a bunch of young people of the same age, the same kind of social strata together, in a place where, they can meet and mingle and have classes together, and form these kinds of attachments. But it's not like, there might be a few people that go to university being like, I'm going to grab me a husband or a wife. I don't know why I used that accent. Just came out. Went for West Tennessee, apparently. Right, that's not typically what people are gonna do. They're coming for the education, but they also get that kind of sorting function that comes along with it. Okay. Do you know if high social bonds correlating to low suicide rate carries over to other groups, Mormons, JWs, and other non-religious high control groups? Okay. Well, let's get to that one last. Okay, do you know if yeah, I mean, to this day, right? Okay, so I'll tell you, this is not necessarily the only word on this. There was a study done, I think, about 2018 of nurses in the United States, right? And basically, it was looking at, because nursing is a high-stress job, what the rates of suicide were for people involved in nursing. And weirdly, it was the same kind of high social bonds communities that tended to generate the most resilient nurses, right? So, your atheist nurses had the highest suicide rate, followed by Protestants. Catholics who rarely attended church had pretty high suicide rates, not that different than Protestants. Catholics who attended weekly or more had one of the lowest suicide rates. Actually, I think the rate was 0 of that, the sample, 0 Catholics who attended church weekly or more committed suicide, and the same was true for Mormons, for Jews, and I can't remember. I don't know about the JWs. I don't know how many JWs go into nursing, to be honest, because there's some problems there. So, yeah, it still kind of holds true in subsequent studies. How about students who go to university due to familial pressure? Well, I mean, presumably your parents are sending you here because of the manifest function, right? They want you to be a doctor, lawyer, nurse, rich person, or some such thing. So they're all in on that manifest function. You just happen to be a victim of it because you didn't want to go. But the manifest function is still why you're here. Did I meet my wife by latent function? Yeah, I met her at university, actually, as it turns out, right? We met on this very campus, kind of over that-ish way. That way. She didn't like me at first, strangely enough. She found me incredibly arrogant, but apparently I grew on her like a fungus. So there you go. I did meet my wife by latent function. You unfortunately fell victim to latent function. I'm hoping you're not like, I met my romantic partner by latent function. Damn it. Maybe you're referring to something else. I wish I hadn't met this person. You don't have to stay with them. You're not bound to them forever. It's your choice. Did someone beat Lily Phillips' record? Oh God, I hope not. That's just a terrible thought. Do you think there's pressure on people going to university to succeed due to outside social pressures, manifest, or latent ideas that have become necessary? I mean, I think it's the manifest ones, right? That you're going to, get a great job that pays real good and all of that fun stuff. Okay, did Durkheim and Hitler work together? Pretty sure Durkheim died prior to Hitler coming to power, but I don't believe so. All right, so for different religions and suicide rates, has Islam or any other religions been added to the statistics? I haven't looked at any kind of subsequent studies. Again, Islam wasn't really a thing in Europe when Durkheim was working, outside of like the Ottoman Empire, but he wasn't studying the Ottoman Empire, he was studying Germany. And I haven't honestly looked at it. I mean, I would suspect, in immigrant Islamic communities, you have a pretty low suicide rate because you would have those substantial social bonds as well. Majority Muslim countries would be a different story altogether. But again, I don't know. I'd have to look. Okay, wait. Did I get everyone? Okay, I got everyone. Okay, so latent and manifest function. Remember these terms. Inevitably, there's multiple choice questions on this. Okay, conflict theory. This is our second. So this is our number two in our list, but not in our hearts. Theory, right? And this, again, is sometimes referred to by a couple of other names. Marxism, or if you're a devotee of Jordan Peterson, no judgment.
cultural Marxism, right? I haven't paid attention to Jordan Peterson pretty much ever, but I remember he was all on about cultural Marxism at one point. I don't know if he still is, and I don't care. So, conflict theory focuses mostly on macro level structures, so on big institutions, and is much less concerned with the personal, right, with microstructures or anything like that. And one of the big things, with any kind of conflict theory is that it tends to be really interested in talking about patterns of inequality, and how these things in some cases produce social stability, and in other cases produce social inability. Sorry, it's been a really long day so far. I don't know if I said, because I can't remember what I was talking about. My TA hasn't shown up back from Christmas holidays, so I had to do her work and mine today, and my brain is slowly rotting. And then I had yet another, I have a second lab that she was supposed to do. Oh my gosh, she's so fired. At 3:30, so after I'm done this, I still have to go till 5:20. This is the second time she's done this to me. She's so fired. Okay. All right. So my brain is a little scrambly at this point because I've been talking almost without cease since 9 o'clock this morning. Okay. So, which I know you're like, oh, poor you, whatever. It's hard. All right. So when we talk about kind of conflict theory, it tends to stress things like privilege, how privileged members of society, seek to maintain their advantage, essentially oppressing subordinate groups, right? Who are also trying to increase theirs. So why is it called conflict theory? Because there is always a conflict at its core, right? And the most typical one, and I'll talk about my buddy. By the way, yes, TAs get paid. TAs get paid more than instructors teaching for the first time. So, when they don't show up, it's a bit of a, yes, I just growled at my TA. Okay, so my next one is Uncle Carl, my buddy, Uncle Carl. We'll talk about Uncle Carl in a second. So, almost always, when we talk conflict theory, we're splitting things up into conflicts, right? One of the big conflicts from the heart of it, and if you look at classical Marxism, right, it's class conflict, right? And Marx has his idea of the proletariat, right, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the ownership class, right? He thinks they're in conflict, and the bourgeoisie is trying to screw over the proletariat and keep all the money for themselves, and the proletariat is trying to get as much from the bourgeoisie as possible, right? But later schools of kind of conflict theory will blend conflict theory with other ideas, right? So you have class, you have conflict theories that are all about race, right? Very famously, you've probably heard the term bandied around in the last few years, because for a while it became sort of the thing to talk about. Critical race theory. Critical race theory is a conflict theory, right? That says that there's conflict between different racial groups, and typically cast as between white people and non-white people, right? With white people trying to maintain their privilege and status in society, and non-white people trying to rise up. You also have conflict theories around sex. So critical feminism, right, tends to be focused on the patriarchy, right? And basically how men are at the top of the social echelon, and women are subordinate to them, and that women are trying to rise up to take, power away from men, or at least to even out the playing field, right? So there's lots of different schools of conflict theory, and sometimes they'll have slightly different kind of emphases. Okay. What would it's great. That's all you're gonna get. No, I mean, obviously, do you want to talk first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism, post-feminism, fourth wave feminism? We can discuss any of them that you like. They're all a little bit different in their orientation. Okay. What would a functionalism question look like on the midterm? We'll get to that. We'll look at some practice questions eventually, but I don't have one handy in my brain right now. Isn't class conflict what was happening right before the French Revolution? Absolutely, right? Or at least this would be the conflict theory argument, right? That right before the French Revolution, sorry, sometimes it gets hard to talk. Revolution, you had the aristocracy and the clerical class, right? That were basically living high, let them eat cake, though apparently that quote's apocryphal. And everybody else was, struggling to survive, and that's what led to that particular revolution, right? But for Marx, right, it was all about typically classes in terms of who was making things versus who was profiting from them in general. Would I be okay if you call it conflict theory Marxism or cultural Marxism? I'm fine. Call it whatever you want. It's your life. I'll know what you mean anyway. All right. So, okay, clear that. How do the different waves differ? Well, we got feminism later. Let's talk about feminism in a sec, and I'll see if I can line things up. Okay, is it like the rich getting richer, the poor struggling like the hood? Yes, that is pretty much it. Okay. What's the difference between Marxism and communism, and which one do I like more? The first part of that question is interesting. I mean, Marxism is the ideology, right, behind communism, right? So modern forms of communism are typically Marxist in some way, right? They take their core ideas from Marx, but the system itself is called communism. Okay, that's easy. All right, let's talk about my buddy, who I actually don't like that much. Okay, Uncle Carl, and I joke, right? I call him Uncle Carl because I feel like I've spent more time with him than some of my actual uncles, because when you're a sociologist, you cannot get away from Karl Marx. He's pretty huge in the field. So I call him Uncle Carl. So Karl Marx, right? You've probably all heard of Karl Marx, right? Lived 1818 to 1883. And his central idea, right, was that basically, I mean, this is the first line of the Communist Manifesto. Something to the effect of, the history of all hitherto human societies is the history of class conflict, right? And he thinks that going back right to the dawn of civilization, you have these kind of have and have not, oppressor and oppressed classes that are struggling against each other for resources, right? And it changes, right? As history goes forward, that conflict changes. New classes rise up to become the dominant class, and new oppressed groups are created by changes in the means of production, right? So in the way that we make stuff. So during the feudal period, like medieval Europe, it was the peasants, the serfs, that were the class of people that were oppressed by the nobles, right, and the kings. In the industrial period, it becomes, the workers or the proletariat that are oppressed by the owners, or what he calls the bourgeoisie. Video, okay. I'm gonna hope that the audio works. It was working in the other classroom before this, so hopefully this works as well. It does not. I'm gonna try that again. Much better if you can actually hear it. All right, try that. That usually works.
Karl Marx on alienation. Karl Marx believed that work, at its best, is what makes us human. It fulfills our species' essence, as he put it. Work allows us to live, to be creative, to flourish. However, the reality in 19th century Europe was that work destroyed workers, particularly those who had nothing to sell but their labor. To the mill and factory owners, a worker was simply an abstract idea with a stomach that needed to be filled. The workers had no choice but to toil long hours for a pitiful wage. What was worse, their labor alienated them. Alienation is a disorienting sense of exclusion and separation. Factory labor, under capitalism, alienated the workers from the product of their labor. They made stuff they couldn't afford to buy. which disappeared to shops in far-off places to make money for people who paid them next to nothing. The factory production line split jobs into meaningless tasks that made the hours at work tedious, empty, and bleak. They became cogs in a gigantic machine. Workers lived for the few hours at home when they could eat, sleep, and relax. The rest of the time, they weren't fully alive. This work also alienated them from each other. The only way out of this drudgery, Marx argued, was for the workers to organize and revolt. They needed to seize the means of production, leading to his famous rallying cry, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains."
Okay. Stop. Okay. I mean, this question, I think, is not super pertinent to what we're talking about. What I'll say is, this idea that communism and fascism are kind of two extremes is one particular reading. I've seen other readings that put communism and fascism much closer together. With fascism having slightly more private ownership, but still a lot of state direction. And I mean, if you think of, say the Nazis were the National Socialists, right? We think of them as the prototypical kind of fascist movement. The Nazis were, a socialist movement. And so I think it's probably kind of correct to think of them closer together, maybe on the kind of left wing of the scale. But we've come to this idea that, they're kind of on this circular scale where it kind of touches at both ends. You have communism and fascism, but I don't know if that is correct. Yeah, I don't know about that. That's speculation. I'm not going to answer that question. Probably not. I answered probably not. I mean, historically, communist movements haven't worked out particularly well. Was the factory production line not invented by Henry Ford? I mean, okay, so the assembly line was invented by Henry Ford, but factories were invented long before Ford's time. And I mean, part of it was you were probably moving products around, right? So if you were, I don't know, this is a terrible example, I use it all the time. If you're making shoes, right, you would be brought a box of half-finished shoes, and you would put the rivets on them where the laces would go through, right? That would be your job. And then you would put those in a box, someone would come, pick them up, carry them over to another place, and hand them to someone else. Relatively inefficient kind of process. Or maybe you move from station to station having to pick up different tools, but you were still in a factory. Now, Henry Ford's innovation is to put this on like a moving assembly line, right? So he takes the already efficient things that are going on in a factory, right? A lot of people working on a single task that they're really good at, a sort of de-skilled work, and he puts it on a moving kind of conveyor belt, right? So that the work comes to you. You never have to move. No one has to go and pick up that box of half-finished shoes and bring it over to you to put the rivets on, right? It automatically comes to you, which sped up the process tremendously, right? And in a lot of ways further de-skilled the process because you got to be doing just like, going from being a general welder on making a car to literally like all you did was one weld, right? You would weld like the door panel on or the hinge on. And that was all you did all day long, was just weld the hinges. Next car comes, weld the hinges. So that's Ford's kind of innovation, is to speed it up by moving it forward. Okay. Don't mean me. Again, let's keep the comments like actual questions so I don't have to take your toys away. What system do I think works best, both in practice and in theory? This is a question for another time and something else. Okay, why do I not like Marxism or Karl Marx? I mean, I'm half Ukrainian, and, communism killed millions of Ukrainians, so there's that. But aside from that, I just think the system doesn't particularly work all that well, and Marx's ideas have been more destructive than anything else. So there you go. Okay. Do I think growing tensions between the wealthy class and working class in the US, there could be something similar to the French Revolution? No, I think Americans are too lazy to have a revolution. For being honest. Okay. All right, Max Weber, next kind of conflict theorist. How are we doing for time? We're doing okay. 30 minutes left. Okay, so another theorist that kind of falls under the rubric of conflict theory is Max Weber, right? And Weber's a funny one, right? Because when we talk about Weber, we're going to talk about him both in conflict theory, and we're going to talk about him as well in symbolic interactionism, because he kind of straddles both of these theoretical disciplines, right? Okay, so he comes along, as you can see, a little bit later than Marx. The biggest part of his kind of active period is after Marx's death. And so he's reacting to Marx in kind of major ways. All right, and one of the things he does is he critiques Marx's argument, particularly with regards to class conflict being the driving force of history. And one of the things that Weber says is, yes, class conflict, economics, right, are all kind of drivers of social change and social conflict, but they're not the only thing going on, right? That there's actually a lot of other stuff happening in the world other than just economics, right? So one of the things that Weber stresses is that, you know, things like politics and religion also have important roles in generating social change, right? That it's not just like Marx is very crude in his history, right? Marx's history is a very, very simplistic one, right? Which is why, you know, I also have kind of no patience for Marx's history. He's a bad historian. Marx's history is very simplistic, right? He thinks that basically history is entirely what he calls materialist, right? It's just related to the physical world, and it's all simply related to changes in economic systems. And what so basically when we go from feudalism to capitalism, that's when social change happens. But Weber is like, no, there are other things that drive history forward, right? There are other things that change, you know, whole social systems, like religion, right, and like politics, that aren't just economic in their orientation. And so very famously, I think I probably have this on a later part of the course, actually. Later part of the course, you know, we'll talk about Weber's idea of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, right? And he thinks that a certain form of Protestantism, you know, Protestant Christianity, Calvinism in this case, was an important factor in the growth of capitalism, right? So religion can be important. One of the other things that he suggests is that a lot of Marx's predictions end up being kind of false. Because where Marx predicted basically that, you know, in the Communist Manifesto, that the proletariat would eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie, you know, kill them all, seize the means of production, and therefore usher in communism. This never really happens, right? And already by the time, you know, Weber's into the 1910s, 1920s, or I guess he dies in the 1910s, it's obvious that there are other forces working. And specifically, that conditions for a lot of workers are improving, and that a lot of people who don't own factories are actually doing pretty well under capitalism. Specifically, right, you get the growth of a service sector, and especially a managerial and bureaucratic part of the economy that is necessary for running complex factories, but where, you know, office workers, managers, supervisors, everybody's favorite people, right, are doing pretty well, right? They're earning higher status and income than workers that are just involved in manufacturing. So he's like, you know, even Marx's critique of capitalism, that it's going to keep the impoverished classes impoverished forever, turns out not to be true. Okay, so again, this tradition of conflict theory comes to North America, right, and eventually into places like Canada, through people who go off and study in Europe, right? And one of these people is C. Wright Mills. Now, Marxism and kind of Marxist thought, conflict theory, doesn't do particularly well, especially in the United States, initially, right? There's a really strong, and you know, the British as well, you know, are not super tolerant of it. There's a very strong kind of anti-Marxist, anti-communist sentiment that runs through American society for a very long time. And you know, America for a long time, including the Academy, treats Marxism as a set of dangerous, or conflict theory as a set of dangerous cultural ideas. But slowly it kind of trickles in through people like C. Wright Mills. Okay, now, it's not until the 1960s that it really, you know, gets a strong hold in the United States. Because, you know, there had been Marxist movements, especially amongst workers, right, communist movements. They're mostly resolved by the rise of unionism in the 1930s and 40s, right, where powerful unions come and really improve the working conditions of a lot of workers. But in the by the 1960s, you get a kind of weird mix of, you know, some Marxist scholars that came over from Germany, you know, after the rise of Hitler, people like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, who start to popularize these ideas within the universities. And then they kind of find their expression in the late 1960s in conjunction with the sort of counterculture movement, you know, the opposition to the Vietnam War, and then some growing kind of labor strife and labor unrest that starts to happen, you know, both in Europe but also in North America towards the end of the 1960s. And any time that you have workers who feel, you know, somewhat unappreciated, ultimately you're going to get kind of Marxist and conflict theory thought kind of bubbling back up. Okay. Okay, I have a bunch here. Okay. So sort of remembering where I am. So, the cultural turn. Right. So one particular thing happens, right? And something that's really important when it comes to conflict theory, and again, with Marxism in general, is that you kind of have a problem. And the big problem is, you know, essentially, that the only country that really embraced kind of and had a communist revolution in the sense that Marx had predicted, you know, was, you know, the USSR. Right, where Russia went through the Russian Revolution, and then Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power and turned it into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, Russia is a weird case, right? Russia is barely industrial at all in 1917, right? It has some growing industries, but it is miles behind, you know, Germany, France, and England. You know, it's only relatively recently, like within living memory at that point, released its serfs or emancipated its serfs, right? So prior to that, it was very much a feudal society in lots of ways, and it's not exactly the poster child for a communist revolution, because it's barely industrial to begin with, right? It's very much a, you know, it should have been the laggard coming into communism, not the leading indicator. But, you know, the USA, you know, the UK, Germany, France, really the and I guess to a lesser extent Japan, because Japan industrialized really quickly. These are the leading kind of industrial powers of the world following the Second World War, and none of them underwent a communist revolution, which poses a problem. Right? If it's supposed to be, you know, economic conflict that leads to a communist revolution, and a capitalism is inherently kind of going to lead to its own destruction, according to Marx, why do the most capitalist countries in the world not end up with a communist revolution, but this sort of, you know, capitalist also ran in Russia is the one that ends up with a communist revolution. So, in order to explain this, Marxists start to do what's called the cultural turn, right? And they start to be really, really interested in culture and how culture can play a role in controlling societies, right? That maybe outside of just, you know, the almighty dollar and living standards, maybe there's a way that capitalism actually keeps itself going, specifically by manipulating people through culture, right? So conflict theorists, take this sort of path and are interested in ways, how culture expresses the ideas of the dominant class in such ways as to keep the whole society in its thrall. Okay. I know there are questions. We need to remember when these theorists come up, no, dates like that, not important. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. We cover McCarthyism. I don't have anything on McCarthyism specifically, but it's an interesting period. Is Max Weber's approach to conflict theory essentially more intersectional than Marx's? I wouldn't say that, no, because I think Weber wouldn't have understood what you meant by intersectionalism. That's a very, very recent term. That's more Kimberly Crenshaw and Crenshaw's idea that, Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality is really a conflict theory, sort of again, you could call it cultural Marxist in some sense, but I don't love that term. It's a conflict theory kind of idea that basically the oppressed are oppressed in multiple ways through different kind of aspects of their identity, right? So let's say for a black woman, she's oppressed both as someone who's black and as a woman, right? Weber is thinking more there's more to the life than just economics. There are ways that, say, politics, religion, and other things actually affect life, more so than just changes in the economic system. Okay. The USSR, okay, how did I discover Cheburashka? This is what happens when you live in Russia. You inevitably become aware of things like Cheburashka. A story for another time. Okay, so isn't Weber's idea of the service sector very Western focused, where much of the world outside Western hegemons aren't service economies? I guess yes, in the sense that Weber is, of course, reacting to his society at the time, which is Germany. So it is the West, and he's looking at France and the US. And isn't that interested in other parts of the world. Same as modern China, where there's a movement of free Hong Kong. I don't know how to answer. The USSR and modern China are very different for lots of reasons, but that's not, that's something that, we can have a conversation about that outside of class. Okay, that's okay. On topic, please. Is China having a strong economy despite being governed by the CCP? It's a capitalist economy with a kind of autocratic government, so I don't know that it's particularly communist. Okay, I don't know how to answer that question. I'm going to skip ahead. All right, so they're complex and interesting questions, but I also want to get to content, and we have limited time. All right, so I'm going to go back to the cultural turn for a sec. One of the key kind of early Marxist thinkers that articulates particularly important ideas about how culture plays into the domination of kind of the ruling classes is this guy, Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci's Italian. He's mostly active prior to the Second World War, and one of his, I guess the thing that makes him interesting in a sense, he writes a lot about culture, and he gets on the wrong, because he's a Marxist, he gets on the wrong side of Benito Mussolini, right, the fascist Italian dictator that was an ally of Hitler's, and he's sent to prison, wherein he writes a series of essays that are now collated together in what are called the prison notebooks, right? So while in prison, he has endless time, so he just scribbles out all his thoughts in these notebooks, and later on they get translated and put into English in what's called the prison notebooks. Probably his key idea, and the thing he's most remembered for, is this idea of cultural hegemony. And cultural hegemony for Gramsci is this idea of how the elites continue to dominate every other class through ideas, right? And basically, his idea is that society is mostly run through soft power, right? He suggests that very rarely will governments or the ruling class bring out the hard power of the police or the army. They prefer to avoid it if they can. Instead, they dominate through ideas. And basically, they do this by constantly kind of working to make their ideas the dominant ones in society, the ones that are accepted by everybody, so that no one kind of resists the social structure that comes from, you know, the societies that they create, right? Because if you just assume that the ideas of the elite are the correct ideas, then ultimately what you're going to say is, oh, this is just the way things are, right? So an example of like a hegemonic idea would be something like the American dream, right? The American dream, right? This idea that, you know, in America, anyone, because it's a free society, a capitalist society, anyone who works hard, applies themselves, does the right things, can ultimately succeed, right? Now, I think today there's some cracks in this idea of the American dream, right? Not everybody sort of adheres to it as closely as they did in the past. But for a long time, this was the sort of dominant ideology in America, right? Everybody knew what it meant when you said, you know, the American dream. Everybody knew. I'm like, are you eating food? I haven't eaten since like 6 o'clock this morning, so I'm really hungry. And I hear someone's like wrapper crinkling, and I'm like, give me food. I'll go eat after. I'm fine. Can you share, please? No. Right, the American dream is such a absolutely dominant idea that everybody would have known and accepted that, yes, you know, if you do the right things, you go to school, you know, you get your grades, you go to college, you get married, you have kids, right, eventually you will succeed and you'll have your little slice of the American dream. And it's this thing that's so kind of culturally resonant because it had this kind of cultural power. The other thing that it has the power to do, obviously, is to sort of explain to people who aren't successful why they weren't and put the blame on them. So it ends up being like, oh, well, you didn't, you know, get good grades in school. You didn't keep your nose clean, right? You didn't, you know, work hard, and that's why you didn't succeed. And takes, you know, basically the emphasis off structural problems. And this is what Gramsci says. If you have an idea like the American dream, you don't ever have to apply the force of the police because everybody's just going to stick to the capitalist economic system and never question, you know, whether that system might actually be harming them. Okay. Would the Nazi secret police be a blend of soft? No, the Nazi secret police are hard power. Full stop. Right? They will come. They would have come. They would have thrown you in prison or killed you. Okay. Well, you should hear about the Canadian dream. If you think America's doing bad. All right. So, how are we doing for time? 13 minutes, too early to stop. Let's talk a little bit about Foucault. So, one of the kind of later thinkers to come along is this guy named Michel Foucault, right? So Foucault is a French intellectual, very much like a radical revolutionary Marxist, right? So he's committed to revolution. You'll see why in a minute, because I'll show you a little video about Foucault. And Foucault, takes a lot of ideas from Gramsci and others, and is very much, again, focused on this question of culture. What he thinks, you know, is that everything happening in a society, and especially any act of speech, right? Any claims about the truth are all acts in the service of power, right? And the power of either the power of someone else, right? They're trying to impose it on you, or you're trying to become powerful by being the one who has the right to speak the truth. So he thinks that culture is this ongoing site of conflict, right? A conflict that never gets resolved between the dominant and subordinate classes, right? Between the elites and the underclasses, right? Where the elites are constantly trying to use their power to maintain that power, and the subordinate classes are always trying to rise up and take power from the elites. Excuse me, hiccups. Okay, and he thinks, honestly, every truth claim, every social interaction is a power play, right? Is some kind of, you know, action that you're taking to subject others, right? To put them under your kind of spell. Okay, now, according to, wow, I want to say, like, I know I go from this picture, and I make it even bigger, he is an intense looking guy, right? Foucault was absolutely a very striking, very intense looking individual. So, according to Foucault, modern institutions basically sometimes use violence to regulate behavior, but typically they rely more on new technologies, and the internalization of control mechanisms, right? So, what he'll suggest is modern institutions are physically and technologically and socially designed so that the authorities, A, can easily observe the behavior of inmates, patients, workers, citizens, and whatever, but also that they don't have to, at a certain point, the thought that you could be observed means that you just follow the rules whether anyone is watching or not. Okay, and I'll give you an example. Because one night, I was driving. Coming home kind of late from a friend's house, and I happened to stop at an empty intersection, right? It was about 2 in the morning, completely empty intersection, one that I knew didn't have any kind of cameras, right? And I got stopped at a red light, and it felt like this red light was taking forever, and yet I sat there in my car at a completely empty intersection where I could see in all directions at 2 in the morning. Why? Well, according to Foucault, because I had internalized the control of the society, right? Or you want to put it in really pithy terms, and I love this because my theory teacher from undergrad, I think she's still here. She's in the English department. Her name's Karen Ball. And she always complained that she wished her parents had called her Cannonball, which I don't know, she thought was hilarious. But she said, what we do and what society leads us to is internalizing the means of our own repression, right? So me sitting there at the empty traffic light, staring at that red light, waiting for it to turn at 2 in the morning when I can clearly see that no one is coming and I could run that red light, I have internalized the means of my own repression. Because the thoughts going through my head are, I can run this light, but that would be wrong. But also, what if a police officer shows up and just sees me running the light? I could get a ticket. I'll just stay. I'll just wait. It's not going to be that long, right? I've internalized my own repression and the thought that someone could be watching me. And we do this all the time, right? When you don't cheat on an exam, by the way, don't cheat on exams. When you don't cheat on an exam, you're doing it because you could be observed, right? And there might be consequences. What if there's monitoring software? What if someone spots you? What if one of your classmates rats you out, which they absolutely will if you cheat. So actually, I've had classmates rat each other out. It's pretty hilarious, right? You cannot trust these people; they are not your friends, right? But also make friends; it'd be good, right? But this is the kind of thinking that leads us to internalize our own repression, right? You won't cheat on the exam because you might get caught. You don't run the red light because there might be a cop or a photo radar camera. Not because it's the right thing to do, because the structures have built that repression into you, right? So that's Foucault's take. How do the elites rule? They rule by setting up systems that make you internalize your own repression, right? You won't steal from the cash register at work because maybe there's a camera. Someone might spot you. Your coworker might rat you out. All of these things also don't do that. That's bad. Right? Even if you have internalized the means of your own repression, it would be bad to do that thing. Okay. How are we doing for time? I think we should. Let's. Are we okay stopping 7 minutes early? Okay. I'm spent at the moment. Let's pause here. I'll put a big check mark here. We'll start with post-structuralism on Thursday. Thanks for all the questions. That's great. All right, we'll come back. Have a good day. Yeah.